Today's session will provide insight into how volunteers play a critical role in self-regulation as well as maintaining the health of the engineering profession. The goal of this session is to develop a common understanding of the role and responsibilities and operating environment for Engineers Nova Scotia volunteers while providing context for their participation on our committees and working groups. Today's session is eligible for professional development hours. The slide deck seen in this session was pre-distributed for this event and is also available for download once we exit the lobby, in the bottom left of your screen in the Volunteer Orientation Slide Deck section. There will be opportunities throughout the session for questions and answers. Those will be submitted using the Q&A option and sent directly to the session moderator for consideration. Only questions related to the session content will be considered. Other questions will be dealt with offline in the days following the session. At the end of today's session, you will see a link to participate in a survey. We kindly request that you fill out the survey so that Engineers Nova Scotia staff can better understand how we can improve upon future goals and initiatives. Without further delay, we will now move into the session environment. Please allow me to introduce our host for this event, CEO and Registrar, Mann, PNG.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you very much for joining us today, taking time out of your busy schedules. Christine has done a great job in introducing the topic, and I think most of you who are either from the list I've seen, all of you are on committees of some shape or form. This presentation is new and has been adapted from the council orientation that we delivered in September of last year. A brand new process to help councillors understand their role. And so some of the slides are written at the council level, but they're just applicable to the committees as they go on. As this is a new presentation, your feedback is really useful so that we can make this a better product to help you execute your tasks in self-regulation. So I'm hoping to get through this in about 50 minutes and then leave time for questions. We had a session last night and I was long-winded, so hopefully I'm a little more disciplined today. So the topics we're going to cover today, we'll talk about the mission and regulatory obligations of the association, how the association is structured. I'd like to talk to you about the existing strategic objectives that were revisited in summer of 2020. We'll talk about the expectations from volunteers. And lastly, some of the administration points that will help you understand what we are trying to do to support you as you volunteer in self-regulation. So I'd just like to cover these points because while most of us have a understanding of why Engineers Nova Scotia exists, I'd like to go through some of the legal regulations and framework for why we exist and the authorities that we're given. So for many of you are familiar from your basic social studies in either junior school or high school, we actually practice, or we are formed under the aspect of administrative law. Three basic areas of public law are the constitutional law, criminal law, and administrative law. So in order to carry out these administrative law duties, the government of the government of Nova Scotia created a statutory corporation, and that is created through the Engineers Professions Act. And the purpose of the association is to assist the government of Nova Scotia in enforcing the administrative laws that surround the practice of engineering in Nova Scotia. And this is actually manifests itself through the direct wording in our Act at Section 3, where the Association of Professional Engineers of Nova Scotia is incorporated. It was incorporated in 1920, and it's given tasks to carry out. Now, Association of Professional Engineers of Nova Scotia is our legal name and our corporate name. And just for interest, Engineers Nova Scotia is our brand name. So when it comes to all legal documents that I'm signing on behalf of the association, you will still see APENs used. So why does it exist? Well, obviously through self-regulation, we fulfill the objects as stated in the Act, and the Act has 4 objects that we are to achieve. The first one is to promote and improve the proficiency of professional engineers. The second is to do such things that will advance and protect the interests of professional engineers in the profession of engineering. Thirdly, to assure the general public of the proficiency and competency of professional engineers in the practice of engineering. And finally, do all things that are necessary for the welfare of professional engineers and their usefulness to the public. So we do have these 4 objects, but there's been a lot of discussion, especially in the regulatory world, over the question of public interest and self-interest. And so we're studying some of these objects right now as we look at our legislation to find out if these will suffer the, or if they will survive the introspection based on regulatory thought today. There's 2 in there that are sort of falling into that realm of perhaps advocacy and looking after ourselves. That being the first one and the fourth one. So one of the tasks that we'll have at the council level as we do a strategic plan is come to grips with how we want to define our objectives. So let's talk about self-regulation. Obviously, a large wording in our objects, and we're trying to strive for what a common definition of self-regulation is. So self-regulation, many of you are aware of it. It's used by most professional bodies, professional regulatory bodies, and it's used by governments to reduce the burden of direct regulation. It's very difficult for governments to manage all the professional bodies that are out there, mostly because they don't have the expertise to do so. It is an exceptional privilege because it demonstrates the trust that the government and the public has in the profession to set aside their self-interest in favor of doing things that are in the best interest of the public. And it's based on an ethos of professionalism and a commitment to service. It's really driven by a concept that we call the social contract, which is deeply entrenched in philosophical and governance writings way back into the times of the Revolution and in the French Revolution and beyond. And there's some great documentation, these being just 2 books that talk about the social license. The social contract or the social license is really it's an informal agreement between the public and the professions that are regulated, and it really derives from the fact that the public believes that the interests of the professions and the actions of the professions are well aligned to meet the goals of the public. The reason that the public trusts us to do the right thing is because for the most part, they don't have the technical knowledge or the experience in order to govern us fully. And as a result, they're expecting us to use our specialized expertise to ensure that we continue to do the right things to serve the public. The professions, on their, so many of them, as you know how many regulatory bodies are out there, they're judged to be virtuous because we have established codes of behavior and codes of conduct that ensure that we are always acting in the public's best interest. And the public also expects us to take action when one of our members deviates from this expectations of professional conduct or skilled practice. And they expect us to investigate complaints and to take disciplinary action when warranted. Now, this social contract or this social license we've talked about is one of the premises of self-regulation. But like anything, a social contract can be broken, usually by the professional organization, and that social license can be revoked. And we've seen several cases where it's been revoked or modified. Many of you are familiar with the Charbonneau Inquiry in the actions in the construction world, and where l'Ordre des Ingénieurs de Québec was put under stewardship until the issues were rectified. We've seen the issues in British Columbia, where the government of British Columbia has now established the Office of the Superintendent of Professional Governance, which is now a regulator of regulators, and a number of things ensuring that public interest is the mandate over self-interest is one of the reasons that this whole new Professional Governance Act has been introduced in BC. And lastly, we've seen actions where regulatory bodies have just been taken away, and the government has taken over the regulation. And we've seen that with the BC Realtors, and not too long ago we saw that in Alberta with the Alberta Realtors as well. So it is a privilege, and it's something we must safeguard through our actions and our thoughts. One of the threats to the social license is regulatory capture, and I just wanted to talk about this a little bit, in the sense that regulatory capture is a general concept out there that regulators become dominated by the industries or the interests of those they are regulating. And that can happen a lot of ways. A lot of boards, a lot of committees can be, the members can be from a specific area or a specific company, and as a result, judgments or decisions can get skewed in one way or another. And the result is that when regulatory capture happens, there's questions of whether we are regulating the way we are supposed to be regulating, which is in the interest of the public. An example of such a case recently is the Boeing 737 MAX. For those that were following all the engineering lessons learned from that whole case, I think that'll be case history for engineers for many years to come. But it's where the Federal Aviation Agency was infiltrated, for lack of a better word, and not through any nefarious way, I'm assuming, but because they didn't feel they had the expertise or they were overloaded, they relied heavily on Boeing engineers to do the work that normally the FAA certifiers would be doing. And as a result, a lot of the safety protocols that were involved were violated because people weren't having the right checks and balance in place. So this is one of the fears that comes into place, and we have to worry about the perception of how we comport ourselves and the decisions we make to ensure that they're defensible, transparent, and in the public interest. I want to talk to you briefly about the Act and the bylaws. And my aim here is not to go in detail into the Act and bylaws. Many of us don't read them. Not me, I have to read them. It's part of my job description, and I have to be aware of them. But for many of the people on our volunteer committees, there's something that exists out there, but there's some great information in there that may help you do your jobs, especially if you're on a committee of council, which we'll talk about later. But I want to talk a little bit about where we derive our powers from and where we can find guidance when we need it. So the Engineering Profession Act basically has 6 different sections in it, which I've used to help me navigate through that area. And I'd just like to talk to them briefly. So the first part is the boilerplate issue things where we talk about definitions and the actual statement that incorporates the association. Next, we talk about the objects or the purposes of the association, and I've talked about the 4 objects before. The ones you see in black here are the ones that I'm actually, council and I are looking at to see if they will fit or pass the test of the current thoughts on regulation. Section 6 talks about the powers of the association. It is a person, it's an incorporation, it's a capital P person in the eyes of the law, a legal entity. And it talks about all the things that we are allowed to do in terms of what we can govern and what we can inspect. Section 7 talks about our membership, the different qualifications needed for each and the classes of membership. It also talks about license to practice, which is a designation that were given to non-residents once upon a time. It has now been taken off the books. We talk about EITs, and we talk about exempted persons. As many of you are aware, there are some professions, or not professions, some areas of engineering where the province doesn't have jurisdiction. For example, if you're a military engineer working on Crown lands, provincial jurisdiction doesn't apply, and you do not need to be a PEng registered in the province where that work is happening, because it's happening on Crown land. Section 11 talks to the obligations of partnerships and companies to get certificates of authorization. Section 12 talks about when and what we have to do in our annual general meetings and where. And Section 13 is large picture descriptions of our council size and the other appointments that exist inside the organization, which we'll cover in a bit. We get into the bulk, which is related to our regulatory mandate. And this is really the protection of the public piece, where we talk about competency and we talk about the conduct of our members. So we talk about what it is you need to become a member and who is responsible for assessing applications in Section 14 about the BOE. Section 17, fairly large, is about discipline. It talks about the large strokes in terms of how our complaints committee works, how our discipline committee works, all the different ways we can launch investigations, what our timelines on meeting investigations are. And Section 18, we talk about the actual registration process and how we keep the register and issue licenses. Section 19, we talk about annual dues. Once again, the information in that section is outdated because it was pertinent at the time that revision of the Act was made, but this is one of the areas that I'd like to clean up in due course. We have an error in that we have two sections 19 in our Act, and the second one deals with our continuing professional development program and talks about how we can strike you from the register if you do not comply. 20 talks about penalties that we can sanction a member for if they're unprofessional or unskilled in their practice. We talk about the limitations on how long we can actually take action against a member. And then in Section 30, we talk about the protections for members of our committees. And I'll talk more about how you as a volunteer are protected by the association, by our Act, and by our insurance as you're conducting business on behalf of the association. We talk about seals, the issuing and use of, that's being the stamp. And then we talk about how we have the council has the ability to create bylaws, to appeal them, amend them, or repeal them. To pass them, amend them, or repeal them at their discretion. So that's the Act writ large. Then we get into the bylaws. And so the bylaws provide a little more detail. So you have the Act, which provides the large guidance and expectations from the government. The bylaws, which go into further detail how council wants things to be done. And then we have a further level, not listed here, we won't discuss in detail, about policy, procedures, and processes, which is actually how we do the nitty-gritty. So when it comes to the bylaws, though, we have the interpretation, which is definitions. We talk about meetings of the association. By this, we mean our annual general meeting, how we conduct them, how we must give notice to our members, and the like. We talk about all the appointments, all the positions that are mandated in the Act. And we talk about how long people can be in office, how we conduct our elections and our nominations for council. We talk about the 6 main positions that are outlined in the Act, and that being the president and vice president who are elected. The secretary, which is a task that I have, and the secretary really deals with disciplinary matters. You have the registrar, who is me too, which deals with the register and the application process, ensuring we have a list of a current list of all those that are authorized to practice engineering in Nova Scotia. And lastly, we have the auditor, who is an external body that is hired by the association to ensure that our financial records accurately and fairly represent our financial statements. Then we get into areas where we talk about guidance to the BOE on what we require for enrollment. We talk about more detail on what we expect from companies and how they register and what their entitlements are. 13C, we talk about professional development, the requirements of our professional development program. 14, we talk about detail on the process that the BOE goes through to process files. We have a section on honorary and life membership. And then we talk about council, how council actually functions, how many meetings council have, what is their meeting supposed to contain, how do we handle if councilors leave, what kind of committees is council allowed to set up. And we talk about this area of welfare of the members. Is council is given authority to arbitrate, negotiate on behalf of the members, but this area has sort of fallen off the wayside based on the question of what is our regulatory mandate and what is crosses the line between public interest and self-interest. So this is not a very well understood or used part that we need to investigate further. We talk about fees and dues, how we handle the funds of the association. We talk about payment of accounts, so where we can spend money. And then we have talk about the discipline and how we must adhere to the code of ethics. We talk about how we're supposed to notify our members. And once again, this may need to be updated because this was written and kept out in the days when we had to send registered letters and mail, and we're becoming more reliant on email, but there's still some legal requirements around that. We talk about how we issue our certificates, what they look like. We talk about validation, which is talking about how we can ensure that our bylaws are actually accurate and written properly. And lastly, we talk about the code of ethics, which is included at the end of our bylaws, which really talk about what the expectations for conduct are. So right now, as it stands, our act and our bylaws are co-joined in one document. And one of my major tasks is to look at severing those documents, because the act itself is an instrument of government, and any changes to the act have to be approved by the government of Nova Scotia. And we want to move to the point where the bylaws actually belong to council, because we have the right to pass, amend, and repeal bylaws. If we keep it as a separate document, it doesn't have to go up to the government of Nova Scotia for review all the time, because right now they're embedded in the same document. So one of the challenges I have. So the statutory obligations, what is council expected to do? In 13.7 of the Act, it says the council shall provide for the general management of the affairs and business of the association, and shall carry on and transact the same in accordance with this act and the bylaws. Very large mandate. And as you know, that is something that council will have a very difficult time doing itself with the members that it has there. So it must create bodies to help it do this task. And that is what we do when we form committees. Now, some of the committees, which we call the committees of council, are actually formed in our act and have different sort of powers have different authorities and different obligations. And other committees, which we call the CEO advisory committees, are actually formed to help the CEO meet the objectives that council provides. And I'll talk more about that in due course. Chris, are there any questions at this time that might need to be answered before I move on?
We actually do have a comment by Chris Davis.
Yep.
He says we don't have two sections, 19s. We have 19 and 19A. This is a drafting technique.
Right.
Allows legislation. Just one sec here. Allows legislation drafters to add sections in the middle of a numbered piece of legislation in a logical sequence without having to renumber all parts, preserving any pointers that may exist within the Act, where one section, subsection, refers to another section by referring to the number of that section.
Okay. Thanks very much, Chris. I am not a legislative expert. I looked at the numbers, so obviously there's a little more detail that I need to learn about there. Thank you for that clarification. So moving on, let's talk about, as we talked about the committees and everything that comes into place, let's talk about the structure of the association and various players in our playground that we need to deal with and work with together. So first of all, this isn't an official, this is more of a PAL thinking and talking to council as we go through our strategic plan. And this really outlines the number of different players that the association needs to deal with in order to carry out its business. Now, where do committees fit in this? Committees fit in that association staff bubble. As I draft the next version of this, I'll make it clear where committees sit in because I sort of included in that sense, but they deserve their own space. There are really two different groups here that I'd like to bring your attention to as we talk about strategic planning in the future. We talk about partners and stakeholders. And partners are considered those, at least in my definition, which we'll see if council agrees with as we draft our strategic plan. Partners are people who have the same mission as us. Now, it might be in a different aspect of professional life, but it's really that mission of protecting the public interest. And stakeholders are those who are affected by our mission statement. Therefore, because we do things to protect the public interest and we make policies and we make decisions that protect the public interest, some of those policies and decisions affect a number of people. And those are stakeholders who are really interested in informing, influencing, and understanding what it is we're going to decide so that they can actually do what they need to do effectively as well. So it's a delicate dance of ensuring that we're in sync with our partners and stakeholders, but always keeping in mind that our prime directive is to protect the public interest. So in terms of the association itself, so you're all familiar, I'm going to talk a little bit more, but as the council, an elected council, that is the one that's responsible for the efficient conduct of the association. And it's the work is done by the staff, which I will talk more in detail. And because there's so much that has to be done and so much expertise that's around, there are a number of committees that come into place. There are the committees of council and the legislative committees. The legislative committees actually are mentioned in the Act, and the committees of council are the ones that are formed to help the council execute the obligations that are listed in the Act or the bylaws. And then we have a series of CEO advisory committees. And these CEO advisory committees are formed in order to help the CEO meet council's strategic objectives and tasks. So a little delineation there. The top part is obviously to meet our regulatory obligations, and the bottom part is to do all those things that council believes are in the public interest and for the health of the association. So I'll talk a little bit more just to give you an idea of how things work for those that are not too familiar. So that council is sort of like an onion. It has layers. Some people could say it's like Shrek, but depends what layers you're actually more accustomed to. Obviously, the president is that link between council and the staff, because that president-CEO relationship is quite strong. And then over on top of the president is the executive. Now, the executive is 3 people. It's the president, the vice president, and the past president. Now, back in the day when we worked by mail and things got delivered by train, there was a thought that council only meets several times a year, and we may have to conduct council business, but we're unable to get council together because of travel times and distance or the urgency of a situation. So the executive committee was formed, and the executive committee is the executive. And because the executive and the offices were here in Halifax, it also included 2 Halifax regional municipality councillors. And this executive committee had the power and has the power to make decisions on behalf of council if time is short. Now, whether that's still required in today's technologically advanced world, where we can hold virtual meetings and we can have instantaneous communications, it's an old construct. We'll see whether it still needs to survive that. And then lastly, you have council, which includes everyone in the executive committee, and then an additional 2 HRM counselors for 4 in total, and then 4 outside HRM counselors, and 3 ex officio members. And the 3 ex officio members are the Engineers Canada Director, which is someone appointed by council to act as a director on the Engineers Canada Board of Directors. We have the dean of engineering from Dalhousie University, and myself, the CEO, as ex officio members. So we are allowed to participate in conversation. We are allowed to offer opinions and recommendations, but the 3 ex officio members have no voting authority at all. So we can say what we think might be relevant to help council make their decisions and vote on issues. The staff itself, right now we have 13 positions, of which 1 is vacant. We're looking to hire, and I'm also looking to hire a temporary position to help out in our communication side. But we basically have three divisions. We have the operations division, we have the outreach and partnerships, DONP, outreach and partnerships division, and we have the registration division. So the registration, obviously one of the largest divisions right now based on the number of applications that come into place. Sandy Oikel and her team handle all the applications and the register and any changes in registration as well. On the other side, we have the Chief Operations Officer, who in the current construct has 3 direct reports: the Director of Communications and IT, the Director of Finance, and the Compliance Officer. Work for Chris Dove, the COO. But given the nature of the way I like to work, I'm very communications and IT heavy. There's more of a direct line between the Director of Comms and IT and me. So we're revisiting that relationship as we move on. And lastly, we have Director of Outreach and Partnerships, Heidi Mcknight, who is Heidi Mcknight Whitford, who is supported by Beth Bellados-Solos, a small team doing a tremendous amount of work in terms of outreach. And this is another area that we need to grow in, that we'll look at in further detail as we look at our strategic plan. So each of these staff members is responsible for supporting a committee of some shape or form. So obviously I look after the nominations committee as we look at getting recruiting potential councillors for the election. The Board of Examiners is looked after by the registration team. The operations team has many committees that it looks after right now. It looks after complaints and disciplines committees. It looks after the scrutineers committee, which I will talk about. I'll talk about what all these committees are in due course. It looks after finance, honors and awards, and the Lieutenant Governor award panel that looks at all the submissions for Lieutenant Governor's Award. And it takes care of 3 CEO advisory committees: the Professional Practice Committee, the Sustainability Committee, and the Health and Safety Committee. And then we have the Director of Outreach and Partnership, which is looking after 3 committees directly, which is the Women in Engineering, the Professional Development Committee, and the Young Professionals. So once again, we're looking at the composition of these committees as we want to grow the outreach area, and there's lots of work undertaken by these committees as we figure out what the optimal structure is as we're going through our terms of reference exercise. We also have 3 other committees that sort of fall into a gray zone right now. Traditionally, they've been dealt with some of the staff because of interest and capacity, but whether they really belong there is a question of structure. First of all, the AGM committee is actually obsolete. Now that the AGM is organized by the staff, we stood down the annual general meeting committee. But we have the Student Advisory Committee, which deals with that outreach part and handing out scholarships and awards and supporting our students for the health of the profession. And we have the National Engineering Month Committee, which is really responsible for organizing the events that are going to happen in the next in March. So these are right now sort of straddling between outreach and partnerships and operations, and we'll just have to figure out where the best place for them to be in due course is. So this is what our structure looks like on our website. We'll be looking at changing that, but as you can see, we've got those CEO advisory committees that fall under sort of the direction and guidance of the CEO. And we've got the committees of council, which are the legislative committees and the committees of council that really have a direct line to council and are responsible to them for carrying out their mandates. So, in more detail, the CEO advisory committees, they've been created by council, and they're created on the recommendation of the CEO or the council. And conversely, they can be, stood down on the recommendation of the CEO or the council. They are limited to act only within the authority of their terms of reference, which are approved by council. They're not mentioned in the act, and they don't derive any power on the act. We look for members for their interest and their aptitude to join those committees, and a lot of times it's the energy that we're looking for those members. It's a policy-centric body. We develop the TORs. The TORs are actually a combined exercise to make sure that they align with what the association is trying to achieve, and they provide recommendations, or they may have some delegated powers, and the terms of reference will decide if they've been delegated powers. But for the most part, they provide recommendations, and some of those recommendations are within my power as the CEO to action, because I've been granted the delegated authority. I have the resources and the time to carry those out. And some of them are not, or some of them are beyond my capacity to approve, and I must go to council to get approval on those issues. Once again, I said they have no legislative authority. They strictly serve to help council meet its strategic objectives as defined in the strategic plan or any other guidance that it may give. And those are the CEO advisory committees listed there. Now that's different from the committees of council. The committees of council, the ones that are in brown there, they're creatures of statute. They've been created by the Act. And they are limited to act only with the authority provided to them in the Act or the bylaws, which will be further expanded in their terms of reference. But those terms of references are really based on what they're expected to do in the Act or bylaws. Once again, we look for members who are, have the aptitude, but we're more concerned with the experience for these individuals now. You will tend to find much more seasoned individuals in these committees right now, because we're looking for more experience and more knowledge to fulfill our legislative requirements. These committees are the seats of all the, really statutory authority and decision making concerning their specific tasks. And they hold independent grants of legislative authority. Their powers are derived from what they're given in the Act. Now, the 4 brown ones, you can see there, I've listed the section in the Act that generates their authority, that states that board exists and what it should do. The ones in yellow are considered committees of council because they actually execute tasks on behalf of council to allow council to fulfill its obligations as expected through the act or the bylaws. So while the finance committee, there's no finance committee particularly specifically mentioned in the act. The act does say that council is responsible for the financial management of the association. And as a result, it's created a finance committee. The same thing goes with honors and awards, and the same thing goes with the Lieutenant Governor Award Panel. Those are council tasks specifically, so they've created bodies to do that. So the question is asked, why do these committees have so much power? Like, why is it? Why do we create these things in the act, and why are they given the authority to make decisions as derived from the act? And it really comes down to it was articulated well in a court decision in 2018 where an individual was suing a PEGA over this was a let me step back. This line was used in a court case that was generated in a PEGA, but the actual comment was made in a case of an individual against the Alberta Dental Association. But what it really states is that the courts and the public, it comes back to social license. They understand that they do not have the expertise and the knowledge to make these detailed judgments that affect a professional who is performing services on behalf of the public. The only people who really know how to assess the factors involved and to apply the code of ethics and to look at all those details that say whether it was skilled practice or whether it was professional conduct are other professionals. And it derives from that line. The relative expertise doesn't exist in the courts. It exists amongst the profession. So that is why those self-regulating committees are given so much power to make these decisions over a person's career and license. So, but we don't always get it right. There's a case in 2015 where a nurse in Saskatchewan made some statements on Facebook regarding long-term care because her father was in a long-term care facility, and she made some statements that some other registered nurses took offense to related to their professional conduct or their practice of the profession. And a complaint was raised with the Registered Nurses Association in Saskatchewan, and the Registered Nurses Association found that nurse guilty of unprofessional conduct because of the comment she made on Facebook. Well, she appealed twice, and in the second appeal that went to the Court of Appeal of Saskatchewan, the court said the association was wrong and overturned the decision. So this is the beauty of natural justice, is though we can make decisions, there are appeal mechanisms in place for a member to seek redress if they feel they've been improperly treated. And that is why it is so important that we work on our policies and our processes and our terms of references to be open, transparent, and defensible. So where do I fit into this puzzle? So the CEO, as you know, I said I had 3 titles. I have CEO and registrar, and I'm also the secretary of the association. Funnily enough, the registrar is mentioned 44 times in the Act and Bylaw. The secretary is mentioned 80 times, and you can see the different areas that functions. And the CEO is not mentioned in the statute or the bylaws. The CEO is an administrative construct in order to look at the actual running of the business of the association. But more importantly, the statute and the bylaw mention council 216 times, either in a definition, an obligation, a duty, or an authority. So I wanted to make it clear that when a lot of people come to me and say, as the CEO, we should do this or we should do that, my power in these things is fairly limited. This is a self-regulation organization, and that's why you will hear me say a lot, that's actually council's mandate. Do I have an opinion and do I have a recommendation? Yes. But a lot of times I do not have the decision-making authority. And sometimes that frustrates committees, but it's the right way to do things because you elected the council and the council is the one who is acting on your behalf. The relationship between council and staff. So council talks to me and I talk to the staff. And it's fairly clear in our documentation that councillors are not permitted to deal with staff unless they ask me if that direct liaison can happen. And that's a very similar construct that we have with committees. Now, committees will have support staff that help them, and there's a lot of discussion that happens at that level. But if a support staff feels at some point, you know what, the committee is asking me to do something that I'm not sure is right, they will come to me and they will ask me whether that is something they can do. And if it's not something I agree with, I will talk to the committee to find out whether we can find a win-win or whether we have to find an alternate way to do that. So though with the CEO advisory committees, the relationship is slightly more informal, there's still that line there that if technically those committees are my committees or help me do my job, and that's where the liaison should happen. Now, I can't attend all the meetings or I don't attend all the meetings, so I have delegated some authority in that sense, but that link always comes back to me in some shape or form if it needs to. So the relationship between the volunteer and the staff, I just wanted to, one concept that I wanted to put out there is that the staff and I are the regulatory experts in the sense that we understand the act, the bylaw, we understand the processes, we know how to get issues from point A to point B and who the decision-making authority is. We also know if we have the resources to do that task. But we very rarely have the authority to say no. Okay? And for the most part, I have a little bit more because I'm delegated that. But if a CEO advisory committee feels very strongly on an issue, then I will take it to council for resolution because in the end, those advisory committees are actually conducting work in order to meet council's objectives. I'm the conduit to do that. If for some reason one of the committees, particularly a committee of council, is unable to make a decision on an issue because a process is flawed, if the decision that's coming on the end is not defensible, open, and transparent, then me and the staff have to sit down and look at the processes and the procedures and make sure that we establish the conditions to make every decision that is made by a legislative committee or a committee of council to make that defensible in case it ever gets challenged in a court of law. Right. Were there any? No, I don't see any questions in the box there, so I'll keep moving on. Let's talk about the strategic objectives. Now, in 2020, we went back and when I arrived in February, I undertook some work to think about what our strategic objectives, at least for the first 12 to 18 months, would be for me to do my work. We are going to embark on a new strategic planning effort. We're looking at RFPs from strategic consultants right now. So we are looking at developing a 3 to 5 year strategic plan. But in the interim, these are the activities that we're working on right now. I'm working on organizational excellence, which is looking at a governance review of all our documentation, our policies, our processes, looking at our enterprise risk. And we have a governance review task force that is helping do that task. That's a committee of council, or it's a task force of council. We're looking at regulatory excellence when it comes to registration and licensing. So 3 things I'm looking at in that sense. I'm looking at the Fair Registrations Act, I'm looking at life membership, and we're looking at how we deal with internationally educated graduates. On the
Can I cut in?
Yeah.
Before you get too far, we do have a question from Chris Davis with respect to the material that was just covered.
Yeah.
He says, how does Article 4.3 counselors play out when a counselor is an advisory committee member Perhaps that no longer happens, but I have been on advisory committees before that had counselors as members. Could this be seen as a counselor directing staff or the CEO? Are counselors still allowed to also volunteer as committee members?
Right. So the answer is yes. We do still have counselors who are committee members. However, right now we're using, until we get a policy to state whether that can continue to happen, right now we're using, I guess, our professionalism to do that. For example, Jeff Knapp, a counselor, is the chair of the finance committee. While Jeff can speak about council activities or finance committees on council, he will recuse himself for any voting matters on that to avoid a conflict of interest because he's involved in that work. Also, we have Ava Parada, who is a member of an advisory committee on the Women in Engineering, but she's also the 30 by 30 co-champion. So that's a dedicated task from council. So an interesting point. I'm aware of it right now, and this is part of the policy work we're going to do to define, first of all, the risk involved in that and whether the risk is acceptable or whether we need to put in a policy that says that is no longer the case. Okay, we'll just move on. So we've got professional practice. This is looking at our sort of internal work here. This is really based on the terms of reference for all the committees so that we can meet the mandates either in the Act or the expectations of council for what those CE advisory committees are actually undertaking. It's also an exercise in streamlining effort to make sure that we're not working at cross purposes. We have stakeholder relationships is something I'm looking at right now. You saw that very first diagram where I talked about stakeholders and partners. I'm trying to get some direction on which are our most critical ones right now. While I can't work on that whole spectrum of relationships, we're trying to identify and gain linkages with those that are really critical to us in the short term. And lastly, diversity and inclusion is a very big thrust line for us. First of all, society expects us to not only be representative of the society that we serve, but we also have to have a very, in terms of the integrity of the profession and the human side of the profession, we have to be societal leaders as well and lead, provide an example in all those areas where we have a lot of questions or a lot of issues around diversity, equity, and inclusion. So what do we want to do? What do I want to do? I want to work on the structure of the organization. I've talked about that. We're updating, creating new policy right now. We're working on the culture of the organization. I'm trying to move us into a digital age of openness and transparency where all of the material that helps us make decisions is available to the membership and the public so that there's no closed veil behind the regulation of the profession. Trying to foster greater member pride. Working on organizational resiliency with a staff of 13, we don't have much depth. And with the information management systems we have in, business continuity is a huge concern of mine. And lastly, effectively engage with our people on the outside, our stakeholders and our partners. So let's talk to the last bit here. And I know that I've gone a little bit over. I apologize for being so long-winded. But for those that still have questions, I'm available to answer those. If you do have to leave before the hour is up, I apologize for that. So the governance manual, there is a governance manual that exists. It's written for council, and I'm revisiting it right now. But this will mostly form. I'm looking at getting it out there publicly for volunteers because it does have some good information on it. It talks about the association mission. It talks about the older strategic direction we had. It really provides a lot on a lot of the information I've given you now on the roles and responsibilities, as well as the governing style and the relationships are included in that document. It talks a lot of policies regarding council process, which we're using as a benchmark to help us with our committee process. It talks about our financial policies, which right now fall to the Finance Committee. And there's a bunch of internal things related to HR, and it talks about all those areas that we want to deal with our stakeholders as well. And then it has a lot of job descriptions in the back of it. So I'm trying to distill what is pertinent to this for volunteers and put it out as a product. This presentation is, for the most part, a product of that governance manual. So volunteers' role in self-regulation. So one of the key areas that I'd like to get in here is, first of all, you're dedicated individuals who have committed your time, your effort, and your energy in self-regulation and helping the profession manage itself. The key thing is you represent the profession and not the constituents. And this is where we get into public interest over self-interest. There are many times we will make a decision or be confronted with a question, well, it's actually better for our members if we do this. We need to look at it a lens is, what does the public expect from us as we make those decisions? The delegated authority, that you're provided are going to be derived from your terms of reference. So understanding those terms of references and helping craft great terms of references really are the foundation of what work we expect you to do as a committee member. We expect you to protect the public interest. We're really concerned with regulating the profession, the competence and the conduct of our registrants. We're really concerned with the practice of the profession and the integrity of the profession. And a large part of the committees, CEO advisory committees, are really related to that integrity of the profession side of the house. What are we doing to make sure that our profession is representative of the people we serve? And for those that are on those committees that deal with finance or oversight, we're expecting you to help us with the competent governance of the association. For the most part, while CEO advisory committees have a lot of hands-on issues, for the most part, committees are there for oversight versus detailed supervision of tasks. They're there to make sure tasks get done, ask me if tasks get done, find out why tasks aren't getting done if they're not, but not actual conduct of the tasks. And normally, as I've learned from the Rothman School for NPF governance, committee members, noses in, ask all those questions, but we're trying really hard to keep fingers out. Now, that doesn't work in all cases because sometimes we need committee members to actually do work, but that's a rule of thumb. And it's particularly important at the council level. It's particularly important for some of the other committees of council like finance. Ask all the questions you want, but we're not going to ask you to do any calculations. We'll provide the data for you in that sense. The code of conduct for our volunteers derived from the governance manual, but there's really 4 main areas that I'd like to talk about. Professional behavior, acting honestly and ethically, acting impartially, and always acting with respect. There's times when we're, displeased, and that's just the nature of the beast. But that doesn't mean we ever have the right to be disrespectful to others. We have respect for decisions, and while this is written from the council perspective, we can debate, we can discuss, we can counter argue all we want in private, but once a decision is made and the door is opened, we all speak with one voice. During the course of your business, you may come in contact with confidential information. While we don't have non-disclosure agreements or confidentiality agreements yet, you're reminded that you're expected to handle all that information with respect and not use it for your own advantage. And lastly, conflict of interest. I'm going to talk more about conflict of interest, particularly in terms of decision making, particularly pertinent to committees of council. Still relevant for CEO advisory committees, but we find cases of that less so. Governing style. We're here about inspiring people. We're here about wanting people to be excited about the profession. We're here about generating interest and ensuring that we do things in the best aims. We're again self-discipline. That's the whole issue of one voice and understanding that even if your viewpoint wasn't the one selected, self-governance means that we are moving in that direction. And we're all accountable for executing whatever our tasks are, because we're executing those tasks on behalf of the government of Nova Scotia. Remember, when we go back to the beginning, it's the government of Nova Scotia that has empowered us to self-regulate, because it's hard for them and they don't have the expertise. But we, by extension, are representatives of the government. And as a result, we're accountable to the people of Nova Scotia. Fiduciary responsibilities, you'll hear this term, you can read this. In essence, a fiduciary responsibility is that you have responsibility to someone greater than yourself. This is where that always the debate of self-interest versus public interest comes in. But your duties, really it's a privilege to be a fiduciary. And we're expecting you to act in the best interests of the beneficiary, which in this case is the association, and in this case is the public of Nova Scotia. And really what I'm gearing at, conflict of interest is probably the biggest issue we come in as a challenge to fulfilling your fiduciary responsibilities. We expect you to show good stewardship, act honestly and in good faith, show good care and diligence, and practice to the best of your abilities. Act with an open mind. Acting fairly is a big part of it's one of our canons in our code of ethics. And to avoid those conflict of interest, I'm just going to push through in the interest of time. Conflict of interest, I think most of you are aware of what a conflict of interest is, but I also want to expand it a bit. It doesn't only have to be an actual conflict of interest. We have to be cognizant of perceived conflicts of interest. Those have just as much impact on the credibility of a decision-making body or an organization as actual conflicts of interest. So think of things about how can it be perceived by others. Your responsibility, if you find that there is a real conflict of interest or a perceived conflict of interest, you should raise it to the chair of your committee to discuss whether the committee believes that you have conflict of interest and should recuse yourself, or whether they believe that the conflict of interest is perceived and can be mitigated. But it is your responsibility to let us know if there are any conflicts of interest. In camera, I will just touch on it briefly. You'll hear the term. In-camera discussions are those where the committee decides that it needs to limit the audience for a number of reasons. The discussions are not put on the record, but decisions that are formed in camera are put on the record. And why do you do this? Basically to have freer discussion. If the council wants to have a discussion on CEO compensation, having the CEO in the room is probably not the best, because the conversation can't happen freely, or the CEO annual evaluation. They may want to discuss it first and then bring them in there. So committees have the right to do in cameras at any time. And so I just wanted you to know, if that happens, the aim of that is to foster more open, transparent conversation. However, while the conversation, debate, and discussion is not a matter of public record, any decisions that fall out of an in-camera are a matter of public record. Lastly, I want to talk about protections. So under the Act, basically there's two areas. For the discipline committees particularly, it says that no damages lie against anybody involved in the discipline association or discipline organization if they take actions in good faith. And lastly, for any committee member or volunteer, Article 30 says that no action can be brought against a council or any committee officer, member, or complainant for anything bona fide done under this Act and bylaws. So anything that's done with good faith without deception or fraud is not, you can't take anybody to court for that. Now, that doesn't mean people won't try, but normally I've seen in other associations, those charges or that action is dismissed under Article 30. Now, if for some reason the courts decide that they do want to hear some sort of complaint from an individual, based on the actions of either a volunteer, a staff member, or member of council. We do have liability insurance, which covers the actions of those that are working on the association's behalf. So feel comforted knowing that we have your back as you have our back. I'm sorry I'm running so long. I thought it was going to be shorter, but I'll go through this quickly. Meetings happen, council meetings happen at this schedule, and in essence, we try to gauge all our committee meetings in order to provide meaningful input for these council meetings. Some sub-CEO advisory committees meet more often, but for the most part, this is when decisions get made by council 8 times a year. I'm not going to talk about agenda. You can read that, but in essence, we try to mirror committee meetings along the same format as the council meetings. Robert's Rules of Order, not so important for CEO advisory committees. Important for council level where minutes become a matter of public record, and the legislative committees where minutes become a matter of public record, especially when it comes to discipline areas. For the most part, we try to follow Robert's Rules of Orders just because it's a good way to run a meeting and it's an efficient way to run a meeting. I'm not an expert, and if we have at the CEO advisory committee level, if we have errors in Robert's Rule of Orders, it's not fatal. We work our way through it. Budget, I'm not going to talk about budget. We'll talk briefly about travel and expense. So the aim is that a volunteer will never be out of pocket for an expense that's made in conducting association business. All reasonable expenses of members or committees will be reimbursed. And the idea is the question of reasonable. I'll just bring it up that it's about our culture and our values and the expectations of our membership on how we dispense money. So we always look at what expenses are. I am not a cheap man, and I'm not trying to save money for the association by not approving expenses, but we do have to look at what expenses are to make sure they pass the Globe and Mail test or our member test to make sure that it's something that the members would expect us to compensate you for or to pay you back for. Again, I'm very cognizant of responsible stewardship versus the perception of self-entitlement when it comes to expense claims. And what is reasonable? Sorry, step back there. What is reasonable? So travel, accommodation, and meals, no issues. If you pay for parking to come to a meeting, we will reimburse you for your parking. So if you have any questions, talk to the support staff. I am the one in the end who approves all the claims that come through, and I understand you give your time and your effort. I am not here to make it out of your pocket either. I want you to not have to pay for anything in order to help us do our work. And the last slide that I have is talk about information technology. So we're moving now to a more digital environment. We're moving to cloud storage. We're moving to a Teams environment. So we're asking, a lot from our volunteers to have computer literacy, having stable internet, and having a webcam, a mic. Right now, we're not providing those to volunteers. That's something we'll have to talk about in due term, but I don't see it being something that we want to get involved in. We have a contracted help desk support that's out there. And so if you do not understand the Microsoft 365 environment, please let us know. And we can point you at resources through videos on YouTube or through the Microsoft site, or talking one-on-one with Christine to empower you in this forum in order to collaborate with us better and probably learn a life skill that will help you in other forums as well. So that's all I have. That's all. I've actually, once again, my time management has been horrible. I thought I would get through this faster. I guess I need to extend the time in future, but I'm open for questions. I'm hoping that you will just stick around, even if that, because the link to the survey is tied to us closing this meeting. So, Christine, any questions out there?
How we do have one right now.
Okay.
It's from Harry Damon.
Yes.
Where might the zone and zone reps fit into the volunteer activities and future plan?
Yeah, that's a great question, Harry. So right now I've been derelict in engaging the zones in helping us do our business right now. It hasn't really been an area I've been able to give a lot of attention to. Um, I see, I've got to figure out where zones fit in, and right now I see zones fitting into the Director of Outreach and Partnerships area right there. In terms of, you know, the participation I see is coming to zones, using zones as a mechanism to get feedback and interaction with the membership. As we've found out now through collaboration on this in virtual environments or online environments, is that structure still valid? Because anyone can join any event from anywhere. Now, I still see a social and sort of health of the professions aspect to the zones. I just haven't got my head around how best to help the zones achieve what they want to achieve. Some zones are very healthy, and other zones are sort of withering as we speak. So I don't know. I don't have an answer for you right now, but I'm happy to engage with you offline and have a discussion on what your thoughts on that topic are.
That was the only question that we have at this point.
All right, I will not keep you any longer since I've kept you 10 minutes longer than I promised. Thank you very much for joining us today. Your dedication to the profession is just shining through, and taking this opportunity to learn more, even if imperfectly, even if presented imperfectly, about the association. I'm pleased to provide that information. And as always, the staff and I remain available to answer emails or take emails. I have a open door policy or an open inbox policy, and I strive very hard to answer emails in a timely fashion. So please feel free to reach out to me anytime. Enjoy your weekend, and it's cold out there, so stay warm.